Announcements. Welcome to this IVSS webinar. The theme for the 2025 IVSS is 30 Years of Globe. If you are unfamiliar with the International Virtual Science Symposium, it provides an opportunity for Globe students all over the world to showcase their research to the community and get really valuable feedback on their work. The timeline for the IVSS, we are currently accepting IVSS reports. So we'll be accepting those through the 5th of March. So we encourage students all over the world to submit their GLOBE research. And we do have one more webinar in our IVSS webinar series on how to submit an IVSS project in a couple weeks. And then after the judging period is complete in early April, we will send our judge feedback to students. So I don't want to take up too much time, but for more information, you can visit the IVSS page. I'll put the link in the chat in just a moment, and you can also access the link through the QR code on the screen. And I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm really excited to have our guest speaker with us today. I want to introduce Dr. Maria Molina. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at the University of Maryland in College Park. She has a really interesting educational and career pathway. She graduated from Florida State with a degree in meteorology and a minors in mathematics and communications. She has a master's in climate and society from Columbia University and a PhD in earth and ecosystem science from Central Michigan University. And her current research focuses on the application of machine learning tools and numerical modeling systems to answer questions related to climate and extremes. And she's going to talk to us today about AI, but she also incorporates open source software and data, accessible communication, and multidiscipline collaboration. So what an honor it is to have her speak to our community today about AI and Earth systems. So Dr. Molina, I will turn it over to you.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Allison, and I'm really honored to be here with you all today. And I'll go ahead and share screen. And to confirm, you can see this full screen, correct?
Yes.
Perfect. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the strengths and possible drawbacks of AI in Earth systems and thinking about how we can leverage this really exciting technology in a way that is ethical and considers potential issues that we can encounter of the application of AI in Earth systems. Specifically for us, we're thinking about things like Earth system prediction, predictability, and also climate change and extreme weather in a changing climate. So I wanted to start out a little bit broader and perhaps think about how we maybe what our perception may be of AI in popular media and perhaps when we were growing up or watching movies and so on. So for me, when I thought about AI, I usually thought about artificial intelligence as being this physical robot that could do actions on its own intelligently. And if you've seen the movie WALL-E or any of the Star Wars films and the subsequent spin-off series, there's a number of robots that appear to have some sort of intelligent life, and it's not explicitly mentioned, but of course we're assuming there that that is artificial intelligence. And we use AI in our everyday world. Many times we don't even realize it. One thing that really surprised me when I learned about it was that when we're watching any streaming service, for example, Netflix, there is actual AI that has learned what images may make our choices more appealing or may make us click on a show to watch, for example. So for Stranger Things, there's a number of these images that have been created and essentially curated and provided to viewers based on their viewing preferences over time that have been learned. And so essentially these are images that make somebody more likely to click on the image. And of course that can be different for different people. And many of us, of course, use email servers and services, and we do have a number of auto reply options. This was actually from a couple years ago. Now you just see it kind of filling in your window. And again, that also being AI and being learned as you continue to use it. But when we think about AI, there are ways that it can go very, very wrong. In fact, there was this back when we had Twitter, not current X, there was a tweet that went viral because there was this new paper and code and open source software that was released, showing the amazing skill of AI in going from a coarser resolution image to a finer resolution image, essentially being able to recover a lot of fine scale detail. But it can go very wrong in that the data that we give the algorithm may potentially bias it. And so in this case, it became evident that folks of a certain background were more limited in terms of their images in the data set. And that ended up biasing the algorithm to reconstruct images, completely changing the race of the person in the coarser image. And if you can't tell, the image on the left-hand side is former President Barack Obama. And he was depixelized in a completely different way, even though for us as humans, that's a very recognizable person. That was not evident to this AI. And this issue has since been resolved, and there's been a number of other examples of AI going very wrong in the real world and every day. And as we catch these instances, folks are able to correct them, but hopefully we can really start to think in advance when we're thinking about extreme weather and our changing climate, because the impact of AI going wrong can be deadly. So for example, here I'm showing a recent or from a few years ago storm that made landfall in Louisiana, and it made landfall down there, but it ended up tracking northward, bringing with it a lot of moisture and extreme precipitation, and ended up flooding areas very far away. So here is an image of flooding in Jersey City, so in New Jersey, very far away from Louisiana, and you had flooded roadways from a lot of the rainfall associated with landfall of this tropical system. And so in our changing climate, we're going to see more extreme events, and we really need to make sure that as we are deploying AI for high stakes tasks like weather prediction, extremes, and so on, we're doing this in a responsible manner. And so when we're thinking about machine learning for Earth system modeling, we have a few different considerations to take in as compared to folks in industry for something like that image depixelization and so on. So we need to consider things like physics and our own domain knowledge of whether it's the atmosphere or the ocean. And we also need to think about the robustness of that artificial intelligence, meaning can it do well in predicting an event that it has never seen before? So can it extrapolate to data that it's never encountered and still do a good job in its prediction? And we also want to have some element of interpretability or explainability where we can understand to some extent why that AI was able to make that decision, or why did it say that that decision it made was very uncertain. This sort of information can really help us determine whether we should really trust the output from that AI model, or perhaps whether we should be a little bit skeptical about what it is telling us about. And one thing that that I've encountered quite a bit with chatting with folks, and I guess now a little bit less, folks are becoming more aware of this, but we're seeing a lot of data issues, or there are biases in our data sets associated with weather and climate. And that's not entirely intuitive, because we usually think about the physical world that we're measuring for weather and climate of variables like temperature, pressure, and so on. There's not really a social component. But if we think about how we measure things like temperature, pressure, wind, and so on, the satellite systems that we deploy and in situ weather stations, those are decisions that have been made by humans. And so humans are in the loop when we're gathering data that we subsequently use to train artificial intelligence models to do weather prediction or climate prediction. And there are a number of issues with our Earth system science data where we have coverage biases, meaning not everywhere has in situ data that is very high quality. And this
¿Tiene tu
is an
cargador de
issue.
tu cámara? Ah, bueno, qué bien.
This
Maria, you're on mute now. Could you? Yes, there you go. Thank you.
Got it. Am I now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Sorry about
Where
that.
did you lose me? No worries.
I think it was just about 3 seconds of muted.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So basically the point is that there are issues with our data sets that we use to train AI for extreme weather and climate, and that can be, of course, really detrimental to the predictions that we end up generating with AI. And I did want to go ahead and take just a few minutes to sort of describe what we mean when we talk about AI or machine learning. And this schematic to me was really adorable when I saw it several years ago when I myself was getting started on this topic. And essentially here with this little drawing, they're showing you on the left-hand side that traditionally, if you were doing any software, coding and development, you would normally give that algorithm some very specific instructions on what to do with the data that you are giving it. Whereas with machine learning, we can now give it data and that computer can take it in and then go ahead and do things with it. So it's a bit more flexible in what we can do. And there's sort of a hierarchy of terms when we're thinking about AI and machine learning. The broadest domain, I would think, is something like computer science, where we just have the study of computers, and that includes software and hardware. And within that, you have artificial intelligence, which includes not just the models that we're thinking about or are going to talk about for the rest of today, but also includes a theory of AI. For instance, what exactly is intelligence? When have we reached general artificial intelligence? And there's a subset of that focuses on machine learning. That was defined back in the 1950s, which is just a field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. So again, this idea that we can give a computer data and it can learn to do tasks skillfully without much more intervention. And then there's a subset of machine learning that is deep learning, which you've likely heard a lot about as well if you haven't used it yet. And deep learning is essentially just the subset of machine learning that focuses on the use of neural networks, typically of several layers deep. And so machine learning and AI and so on have a very rich history. So they've been around for quite some time, dating back to the 1950s when we just mentioned machine learning was defined. And there were several periods of reduced excitement for AI. And that was really because of reduced progress, where people were hitting computational limitations, or there were big promises that were released on what AI could do, and then it under-delivered, and then funding fell as a result. And so that was back in the 1970s and 1990s. But in between that, there's been a lot of excitement and a lot of development and quite a few technological advances that have really helped us even till today. And in more recent years, we've had an explosion of AI, and that's been a confluence of several things that includes graphics processing units, or GPUs, which were actually developed for the gaming community. The gaming community wanted very fast rendering of their graphics, and GPUs were developed, and it turned out that GPUs were actually also really good for matrix multiplication and for training neural networks. And so that really helped accelerate a lot of the training of these very big models. And you've also had the internet and many social media platforms and many people becoming very reliant on the internet and sharing images and so on. And so there's been the creation of very large data sets that are high quality and have associated labels that were completed by graduate students at places like Stanford University. And that ended up leading to several benchmarking competitions where people would compete to train on a specific task and develop a winning model and win a financial prize. And of course, the recognition that comes with it. And so that sort of competitive framework also helped accelerate to see some of the advances that we've seen recently. And then, of course, importantly also is open source software. We've had Python that Python itself has been around for, I think, over 30 years, but more recently with its very dynamic and huge community that communicates online and people are collaborating together on places like GitHub and so on and sharing this open source software. That's also taken time to grow, but now has also facilitated these Python language packages that may have other languages under the hood at times, but because these are open source, they also really have helped to accelerate the uptake of deep learning because these deep learning libraries are open source. And a lot of the development for these packages came from places like Meta, which used to be Facebook, for one of these packages. And you also had Google for TensorFlow and Keras, which now Keras has version 3, I believe. And often you'll hear about machine learning and that it requires very big data. In fact, I just mentioned in the history of machine learning that a lot of the recent advances are because of very big data sets with high quality labels. But it turns out that we do have a number of different types of machine learning approaches. So when we're thinking about neural networks, that's a space where we are better off if we have a lot of data. But there are also other approaches, and these are machine learning approaches that can be taken when we have more limited data. For instance, when we're thinking about using symbolic regression, which is just equation discovery, having a little bit of data is just fine to help us derive some equation for the physical system that we are interested in or other applications. And we can also move from a data-rich area, so we can pre-train a neural network in a space where we have a lot of data, and then use other methods such as transfer learning to take that model and continue training it in a space where we have more limited data. And so again, this is a spectrum of approaches that can be taken to leverage places where we have a lot of data to places where we have perhaps more limited data. When we have more limited data, that means that our domain knowledge is going to be increasingly important, and we'll have to rely on that some more. For example, PINS is physics-informed neural networks, where we use our understanding of physics and incorporate that into a neural network, reducing our need of a lot of data and also hoping to make it robust and able to extrapolate to unseen data sets. Otherwise, when we're thinking about the weather prediction and climate modeling space, we can use machine learning for many different stages of the modeling framework. So normally when we're running a numerical model, we might create some input of the data or the state that we're trying to represent. For example, if I want to create a weather prediction for tomorrow, I'll have to create a representation of today, perhaps on a grid, assimilating a number of data observations from around the world if I'm doing a global simulation. And so that will represent my initial state that we're going to start from. Then I would use physical equations, a number of physics parameterizations that are going to represent processes that perhaps my numerical model doesn't explicitly model. And I may rely on high performance computing to run this model forward in time. And so even for a global weather forecast that is run to tomorrow, for example, so just a 24-hour period, it would be pretty expensive to run that because you would have much shorter time steps every couple of seconds, minutes, or so on, depending on your horizontal resolution. And then you'd be done running your model to whatever lead time you were interested in, and then you have output. And so at each one of these stages, you could use AI or machine learning. So for example, at the initial state, you could use machine learning to do things like assimilate your data observations, or you could even ask questions like, where would I gain the most skill from the placement of a new weather station? Perhaps there's a location that I might get a lot of improvement in my numerical model if I place a station there. So there's techniques like active learning that can help with that. There's also the use of machine learning or AI in the running the model stage, where we can do things like create physical parameterizations for things that are not explicitly modeled, and maybe they are not done very well presently, and you think you can get a lot of improvement with a machine learning based parameterization scheme. For example, cloud representation is one challenge in climate models, and there are folks that do work on machine learning based parameterization schemes of clouds to try to improve some of those biases. And then at the output stage, you can do stuff with that data. You can use machine learning to perhaps increase its horizontal resolution with downscaling. You could correct some of the biases that you end up with if you know what your actual truth should be. And you can also extract information using tools like explainable AI and so on. And more recently, there's been a lot in the news with AI completely allowing us to completely bypass the running the model stage, where folks have trained very large AI-based models that take in some representation of the initial state. That could be either already data assimilated information or even raw radiances from satellites. And they use that to start from. The AI runs it forward. So we're no longer using physical equations here. We're just using learned relationships that were learned by AI and outputting some lead time that we're interested in. So here I have an example of S2S, which is sub-seasonal to seasonal. That can be 2 weeks to 3 months, but there are, of course, the weather timescales and the climate timescales. So let's say out to the year 2100 is a much bigger challenge for AI. I would say we have a lot more confidence in current results at the weather timescales. And some of the recent work that has come out regarding the use of AI for weather forecasting has made the cover of Science, has been covered by the New York Times and many other media platforms, and essentially just generating a lot of excitement because these results have at times shown that they can either perform as well as our state-of-the-art physics-based models or even exceed the skill of some of our physics-based models. So again, there's a lot of excitement of the use of AI, but how do we do this ethically? And how do we make sure that we're not learning biases that we already have in our data as we continue to move forward and work with this technology? So I do want to give you some examples of the work being done in my group. And you'll hear me use the terms prediction and predictability. And there is a difference between these two words. It's very subtle, but there is a difference. So when we're thinking about prediction, we're purely referring to just some forecasts at some time that we're interested in. So perhaps a weather forecast for tomorrow. And this could also be an outlook that's generated for future conditions. For example, I might say, there's going to be above average precipitation over the Southeast US in 3 months. So that'd be more seasonal type outlook. And then when we're thinking about predictability, we're really talking about what is the inherent upper limit. So the most skill we could potentially get based on the ability of that respective model and that respective state. And so here we're really thinking about what if we could remove all the errors from that model? What would be the best we could do? At the end of the day, there is chaos in the system, and we're not going to be able to predict something out to a future time perfectly ever because of some of the inherent randomness in their system. And so I do have a group that has helped a lot with the research that you're going to be seeing today. So I did want to acknowledge them. There are a number of folks, and some are international, including Dr. Manuel that is in Spain, and we do have a number of students here at the University of Maryland. So I wanted to share their faces, and you'll see other students as well in the upper right that are folks that I either serve on their PhD committees or collaborate with. So here we have work led by Mary Grace, who worked with me to generate objects or to train AI that could identify organized thunderstorms in global climate models. And so we were able to train this using satellite information and past identified thunderstorms. And even though we only had data over the US, we were able to apply some techniques to improve the generalization ability of our AI approach. And it was able to now detect storms also in places in the Southern Hemisphere, over ocean where we didn't have in situ data and so on. So that was pretty exciting to see that with certain techniques, we can make our machine learning more robust and able to perform well in other areas around the world. And here, this animation that you're seeing, this is an animation that was created with Katie Dagan, who is a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado. And you're seeing a number of fronts that are moving across North America. And this is actual AI generated fronts. And you can see that these look very realistic. You have your cold front that then transitions to stationary. There's also a warm front blob, and at times maybe looks a little not so great. But overall, this is, again, AI generated. And what this does is allows us to generate and track objects very easily and very rapidly to analyze how, for example, these objects are changing over time, and to identify biases as well in our weather and climate models. We can also use machine learning approaches to ask questions of the Earth system. For example, Jairon, who's a current PhD student here at the University of Maryland, use XGBoost. So this is extreme gradient boosting, just a tree-based model, to create an experiment on asking questions about where predictability comes from. And so he was inspired by this image on the left-hand side, where we know that for seasonal timescales, when we go out beyond 30 days, we know that most of the predictability for conditions in the atmosphere actually come from the ocean. The ocean has a lot of memory, it has a lot of heat capacity, and it actually is a great source of predictability. And at shorter timescales, like subseasonal, so out to about 2 weeks or so, we get predictability from land conditions. So there's things like soil moisture and other processes that are slower evolving that give us some ability to anticipate conditions overlying that land or perhaps downstream of that land. And then at the weather timescales, a lot of our predictability really comes from the initial state, which, and specifically the atmosphere. Whatever is happening upstream is going to move downstream, and we can anticipate that with pretty good idea. And so what he did was he said, is this image on the left-hand side, this is a schematic, actually going to hold if I do an experiment? Because it's sort of an idealized schematic based on a lot of domain knowledge, but we wanted to see how well it held. And overall, machine learning was able to show that this did hold quite well. So he currently has a paper that is under review, and essentially was able to show that while that schematic is indeed generally accurate, when you break things down by season, it changes. So in winter, we see that the atmosphere gives us a lot of predictability during early lead times. That holds true for spring, summer, and fall. But then when you get into later lead times, things get interesting. So in winter, machine learning is showing that actually you can get pretty good skill from the atmosphere. And it turns out that this is from the stratosphere. So stratosphere can propagate signals down into the troposphere and offer a source of predictability there. And we can also continue moving forward in time, and you can see land emerge as important from soil water content or soil temperature and so on. So again, it was just cool to kind of be able to take a schematic that was created by humans and put it to the test with machine learning and machine learning based experiment. Something that's really important when we're thinking about ethical use of our machine learning models or any sort of model is understanding its uncertainty. So meaning how confident can we be about whatever the prediction is. And the thing is, we have uncertainty from different sources. Uncertainty could either be because we have too little data in that location or too few samples that are like that respective atmospheric pattern. We really haven't seen it before, so we're not really sure. Or it could be because there's a lot of uncertainty in that state. It's just inherent to the system, meaning it's just really tough to predict that specific pattern, even if we have a lot of samples of it and it's happened a lot. And so what we did is we said, okay, can we decompose these different sources of uncertainty? And so Matt Chan, which is a PhD student from computer science here at the University of Maryland, ended up using a diffusion model, which you can inject with some noise to create a forecast at a future lead time. Here he's using ERA5 at the initial time and predicting forward in time. And then he used a hypernetwork, and the hypernetwork's role is to actually predict the weights that go into the diffusion model, which is really neat. And so then he went ahead and said, okay, we can also add random noise to our hypernetwork. And by injecting the hypernetwork with noise and freezing the noise in our diffusion model, or vice versa, we can decompose our uncertainty into two types. One is aleatoric and the other is epistemic. Aleatoric uncertainty is simply what is inherent to the system. So meaning that pattern is just really tough to predict and we have a lot of uncertainty associated with it. Epistemic uncertainty is when we don't have enough samples of that pattern, right? So it just hasn't happened a lot. And so we can't be sure if it's likely or not likely to happen because we just haven't seen it before. And so here we can see that in this example, he ended up injecting artificial noise in northeast portion of North America, and our epistemic uncertainty lights up in that same area, telling us, I've never seen this before, or I haven't seen this very much. I'm very uncertain about this. And it also shows up in aleatoric, but we caveat that when you see something in epistemic show up, you shouldn't trust its aleatoric uncertainty. But in the western parts of North America, British Columbia, you can see that we don't have much epistemic. It seems like that specific weather pattern is simply very uncertain and tough to predict. So there is aleatoric uncertainty associated with it. So it's just one approach out of other approaches to be able to decompose sources of uncertainty. And so I'm being mindful of time, so it's 36 after the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and dive a little deeper into two specific projects that I'm currently the lead of, but also working in conjunction with my team. And this focuses on weather forecasting, or more specifically subseasonal forecasting, when we're forecasting out beyond 2 weeks, so beyond the weather timescale, and we're into 3 to 4 weeks into the future. And this is a forecasting time that is extremely challenging because we have lost predictability from the atmosphere, and we're supposed to be getting some predictability from the land, if you believe that schematic that I showed you earlier. But this is also known as like a predictability desert because there just aren't very many sources of predictability. Long-term memory from the ocean hasn't kicked in yet for seasonal skill. So we're at a bit of a challenge here. And so what we wanted to do was say, okay, we know that this is a tough time to predict, and we know that our model is going to drift away from observations. And we know that that has to do with, in part, model errors, meaning our physics-based model errors or our AI model errors. And it also has to do with the initial condition errors, meaning we're not able to perfectly represent with our initial state, even though we have observations, there are still limitations in our ability to represent conditions entirely. Our data is somewhat flawed, or we have to grid it, and by gridding we end up losing or smoothing information. And so we're going to get some error from that initial condition. And so one way that we can try to get at the initial condition uncertainty is by generating various perturbations to that initial state or initial time that you're going to start your forecast from, so that you can end up creating an ensemble, a number of different forecasts that go forward in time, and you end up with a distribution of possible future outcomes at your lead time of interest, here being subseasonal, so in 2 weeks 3 and 4. And so we said, okay, great, we're going to go ahead and use a physics-based initialized subseasonal prediction system. This is the Community Earth System Model version 2, or CESM2, from NCAR, again in Boulder, Colorado. And here we have a hindcast, so past forecasts that we've created because we know what happened in those 20 years and we can evaluate how skillful this model is. So we use our 20-year hindcasts, and we end up using machine learning to do a couple of things. The first thing we do is actually evaluate its skill in a weather regime framework. And the second thing we do is do a bias correction task where we improve our physics-based model using AI and machine learning. And so first I'll focus on the weather regime evaluation. You can use machine learning to evaluate how well your physics-based models do. And one way you can do that is by using unsupervised learning to characterize patterns in observations. And then you can use that pre-trained unsupervised learning algorithm from observations and feed it model data, physics-based model data, so that you can see how well your physics-based model data measures up to the patterns that were identified in observations. So more concretely, in this example, we have large-scale atmospheric patterns that we call weather regimes. And here we're showing them using geopotential height anomalies, which are essentially the height at 500 hectopascal. When it's positive, you can sort of interpret that as high pressure. When it's negative, you can interpret that as lower pressure. And this is, again, relative. And what we're seeing here is that we have different large-scale patterns that tend to be very recurrent at these subseasonal timescales, and this offers us some predictability. And there is a signal at the surface. For example, the Alaskan Ridge. You can see we have this these patterns here, and they have associated precipitation anomalies. Here you end up with the jet sort of impacting California, and you have above average precipitation in California, and then drier conditions associated with high pressure over British Columbia. And so we trained this k-means clustering algorithm using ERA5, and then gave it CESM data after the fact to see how well its frequencies measured up at different lead times. And so we can now plot those by lead time in this bar plot. And so at day 0, we can see that ERA5 and CESM2 show very similar frequencies of each weather regime, which is great. We know that, again, over North America, we identified these 4 very recurrent persistent patterns, and it looks like CESM2 in this initialized framework is performing comparably to our reanalysis product. But as we go forward in time, we start to see CESM2 diverging from our reanalysis product, where we have the Alaskan Ridge at weeks 5, 6 occurring with fewer times, and we have this other gray shaded area, which is the West Coast High, occurring with greater frequency. So it turns out that our predictability of this Alaskan Ridge regime is much lower due to CESM biases in simulating this type of weather regime. So again, this is one way we can use machine learning in an unsupervised way to characterize large-scale patterns in reanalysis, then freeze the algorithm and use it pre-trained on reanalysis to analyze patterns in our physics-based models. And with CESM, we have a number of ensembles. I believe it was about 11. And with this simple framework, using k-means clustering and looking at weather regimes, we also identified a period of time where you had spread increase as expected, but then sometimes you would have the ensemble members converge again during a later lead time, which was really unexpected, and we were unsure why. So initially we thought there were some code bugs, or, you know, is this just by chance? Is there actually something physical in the Earth system that's leading to this better performance? And so we ended up creating a couple of plots and look at patterns upstream of North America, and actually found that indeed there is a physical system or a physical signal that is contributing to that ensemble realignment. And so this plot here on the left-hand side is a bit confusing because it's just trying to incorporate a lot of information in different dimensions, but I'll explain it here for you. Hopefully I do an okay job. On the x-axis, you're looking at lead time. Each number is a day, so it goes out to like 46 days. On the y-axis, you have how many ensemble members agreed on a forecast of a certain regime. So the maximum you can have is 11 because there are only 11 ensemble members. But it turns out the most we end up getting agreeing, at least on this forecast, is 10. And so here we have CESM that was initialized on November 9th, 2015, and it runs forward for 46 days. And if we look at these X's and circles, when they're the same color, that means that CESM got the forecast right. So in the first few days, it got the forecast right, which it should, because it's very close to when we initialized it. So that's a good sign. But then we start to see the X's and circles dropping down lower on the y-axis. And this is because our ensemble members are now spreading. And so they're not really agreeing anymore. There's a period of time or a couple of lead times when only 4 ensemble members agree, which is very few. And we can also see that the X's and circles now are different colors. So we also have wrong forecasts being generated by CESM. But then suddenly by lead time 25 to 30 days, you start to see a lot more ensemble members agreeing, and CESM is getting the forecast right. And so we ended up looking at a number of different fields. Here I'm showing outgoing long wave radiation over the North Pacific and the Indian Pacific Ocean. And it turns out that skill was very poor in ongoing convection over the North Pacific during the period of time where there were wrong forecasts. So there was convection going on or not, it was wrong over the North Pacific, and that signal is propagating into the North America region and producing incorrect forecasts. But then you had a signal propagating from the Indian Pacific Ocean, so this is likely Matt and Julian oscillation related, And once it enters the North Pacific and continues propagating, it leads to the ensemble realignment that results in a correct forecast. So that again was very exciting. This is just one example though, one forecast. There are times that you can get this sort of realignment and the forecast be completely wrong. So it can also work against you. But anyway, again, that's one example of using machine learning for model evaluation. We can also use it for bias correction, and I'll go a little bit quicker in this example, acknowledging time. What we mean when we say we're going to do bias correction, we mean this offline. So after the model was run, the physics-based model was run, and we're going to use machine learning to learn its systematic biases and try to correct them to make them more like observations. And what we ended up doing was saying, okay, this is a relatively straightforward approach. We have our physics-based model. In this case, it's CESM2. We have our observations, which in this case, we're using reanalysis, which has a number of issues as well, but we're just going to treat it as ground truth for now. And then we use machine learning to reduce that error. But as we were moving forward on this work, the issue that happened was we were like, well, what exactly is error? If we just mean root mean squared error, we can reduce that. But some people were particularly interested in reducing biases associated with the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Other folks were only interested in reducing errors over land. They didn't really care about temperature and precipitation over the ocean because they wanted this product for forecasting. And so we arrived at this situation where we realized we have real world complexities coming into our science problem, where now we have different objectives that people have competing with each other. And so we reach a point where we can't really improve on one objective without doing worse on another objective. And so that is referred to as the Pareto frontier, when you have a certain model where you just have these two competing objectives, and you have to make sacrifices at a certain point in one objective to do better in the other. And so what we ended up saying was, okay, instead of picking just one objective to improve or one definition of error, we can leverage our competing goals and use them and see if we can arrive at certain models that can do bias correction at the Pareto frontier of our competing objectives. So we came up with a number of different metrics. The important thing here to note is this dx dy is referring to gradients in the horizontal. And essentially, some folks were really interested in ensuring that we conserved spatial sharpness of the images coming out of the CESM. And the reason for that is that CESM, or any coarse grid numerical model, will smooth out patterns of precipitation or temperature over terrain that is sharp, like mountains or coastline. And that's kind of problematic if we have extreme events and folks want some of those fine scale details captured. So we wanted to focus on sharpness and also generally reducing mean squared error or mean absolute error. And so we ended up using an image to image model, but we wanted help in figuring out what the hyperparameters were of our respective image to image model. So we employed Optuna, which or Echo, which is a wrapper around Optuna, to essentially figure out which hyperparameters in our machine learning model would result in the best performance in our bias correction objectives. We had 3 objectives that we came out with. We ran over 1,000 iterations in this respective study, and we found that there were 53 models that performed really well in our competing space of objectives. So according to this single run or this single study, there were 53 in that space. And then we can see what these different models look like. For example, there were a number of different image-to-image models that we employed, including the UNet, which is a classic image-to-image model, but then a number of others like LinkNet and so on. And so there were a number of different architectures in that 53 identified models, and also different training losses. And one of the ones that happened to be the best performing many times surprised me. I wouldn't have used it as a loss function, which is Huber. And others were like mean squared error and so on. We can go ahead and plot the performance of these models along this Pareto front. And it's a little difficult to see because it's 3 dimensions, but essentially the take-home message that we realized was we can't really reduce error associated with sharpness, so terrain features or coastlines, without sacrificing on mean squared error and mean absolute error. So we really have a very strong gradient here, and competition between sharpness of an image and mean squared error. And so just a couple of pros and cons is this is, of course, very computationally expensive. I showed you just one study that involved over 1,000 models, and you can still run that for much longer. And there are pros, though, particularly being that you don't have to make choices or sacrifices if you have a couple of competing objectives and you decide that they're all really important for your respective stakeholders and you really shouldn't get rid of some. There's a couple of works that have come out of this in terms of collaborations. There was a draft version that's publicly available, but this paper is under review and should be coming out soon, I hope, led by Emma and a number of others from the NSF AI Institute, led by Amy McGovern out of University of Oklahoma. And here is an illustration of what we mean by sharpness. You can see in South America, you have the southern part of South America. CESM2 has very smoothed out, has the Andes very much smoothed out. Even ERA5 had it sharper, which is kind of wild because reanalysis is also pretty smooth, but we were able to correct some of those issues with our image-to-image approach. Making sure that we are measuring uncertainty, again, is always important. But with that, I will go ahead and wrap things up. Just a quick summary. Again, we use unsupervised machine learning methods for assessing model skill. And of course, you can also use it for bias correction and also determining what hyperparameters you should use and model architecture for your respective problem and trying to improve the performance of your specific application. And so with that, I'll go ahead and stop talking and see if anyone has any questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Molina. If anyone has any questions, feel free to type those in the chat. I have a question for you, Dr. Molina. Oh, here we go. Rusty has a question. Or a comment. Fascinating and so useful at both the intro and advanced levels, which I agree. And I'm wondering, what, if any, advice would you have for young scientists, young researchers, or maybe educators who are interested in looking at globe data with machine learning to kind of get started?
Yeah, to get started, there are a couple of resources that have been made available in recent years that are extremely helpful. So first, if you are able to register or apply to attend any sort of hackathon or school, for example, my first workshop or way that I got introduced to machine learning was at Berkeley Lab in California. there was a summer school back in 2019. I applied, got a spot, and went. So those are, of course, ways to do in-person activities, but there's a number of ways to get involved online as well without having to travel and perhaps go more at your own pace. I would look on YouTube. There are a number of courses or faculty that have made their machine learning courses available online. TensorFlow, Keras, and PyTorch are big, deep learning libraries, and they themselves do have a number of blogs online and open source software and examples with data sets online. They're not using globe data sets, but I think that could be really fun to come up with some example notebooks for globe data specifically to train some machine learning models and put those online for examples. I myself teach a course as well called Neural Networks for the Physical Sciences, and I do have a GitHub repository with our notebooks and all of the data, I believe, is either open, is probably open source. If I try to make it that way to make it easier for the class to access data. But you can find it on GitHub. The course is called this. And I think I used not Jupyter notebooks, but I think I did Colab for these, Google Colab. You can just click on a link that's there, and so that's the name of the class. See if you can find it on GitHub, but I can also follow up with Allison with the link to that repository. So I do have a number of examples, and this is a graduate level course, but it should be all commented and accessible for anyone that wants to walk through that. And of course, you're welcome to send me questions as well. Additionally, there are a couple of publications that have come out. If you're interested in weather data, I can also send you those resources, Allison. These are open source publications for like tutorial type publications in the Artificial Intelligence for the Earth Systems journal from the AMS. And again, I can follow up with those. So they have two. The first tutorial is for machine learning. Second tutorial is for deep learning. And there's a third one that came out for explainable machine learning applications.